Hey, business storytellers, it's Christoph Trapp, your host and author of Content Performance Culture. Thanks for joining me. This is a live stream of a recording of the Business Storytelling Podcast. Thanks for joining us on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, any comments, feel free to leave them right below there and we'll try to get to them. It is honestly kind of hard to keep an eye on them while we're also talking about today's topic. Also, shout out to Switcher Studio. We're still using their platform here. Really, really appreciate that team over there. Lots of improvements that they're made recently. I'm now doing everything on my iPad, including the me talking and then also the production. So that's something that was not doable with before the previous update. If you want to use them, Trap gets you 10% off through the end of the year. Definitely a fan if you have not heard me talk about them. Today's episode, we want to talk about how do we keep track of metrics in with your podcasting, and I want to show you a couple of things here. I just pulled this earlier from Anchor, and I love seeing where people come from, what they're doing, where they're listening. The podcast episodes have gone up. I think the last couple of weeks I've had more listens in the 2 week period than a previous month had. So, but interestingly, here you can see where people came from. I think the other, and we'll ask our expert guest when we get to him in a second here. The other, I think, has to be Google Podcast and those, because I push the Google Podcast app all the time, and there's many other apps that people can use as well. And now something froze up on me here, so let's see if I can get to the next screenshot. Was just singing the praises of Switcher, and now it's frozen on me. Help! How do I get back? That is not it. Okay. The other graphic I wanted to show you, and I really truly see how slick that was. Split screen. I love looking at the top episodes, and it's always interesting to see which episodes actually perform. And the top one, which I think is hard to top, is the one where I talked to Mickey, the founder of the Adweek parody Twitter account. And of course, he talked about who he is, what he does. Hard to top. It was kind of behind the scenes look. And then we have how to handle corrections to the web, which was just me talking. And then how to navigate the ever expanding MarTech technology. Scott Brinker was the guest on that, and of course he certainly is an expert out there, and of course when he talks, people listen. And then we had the one with Ashley Cummings about how to hire writers, and then Mael Rod was finally the guest on that other one. So today's guest, though, let's jump right in. Today's guest is Sean Creeley. Sean is with podsites.com. Don't remember how I ran across Sean, but Sean's company looks into attribution and really how we can make those things better for advertisers and really all of us. Sean, how's it going?
Good, man. How are you?
Living the dream. If you've anybody been following on LinkedIn, I'm in Iowa, of course, and we had the inland hurricane come through here. So it is super crazy. Just got internet back yesterday or the day before.
Oh, wow.
We're going live here, which is, I don't know if I moved our recording, but I moved a bunch of recordings and live streams. So Sean, tell me about Podsites. What do you guys do, and how do you try to help podcasters?
Sure. So we work with brands and agencies for podcast attribution, which is sort of the holy grail if you want to talk about how podcasting currently works, right? What you just did at the top was sort of an offline methodology, right? Like you shouted out a brand, you used a promo code, and that brand is now using that promo code to say like how many people from this podcast, et cetera, actually came and purchased based off of that recommendation, right? What we do is pixel based. So instead of using traditional offline methodologies, off discount code, custom URL, what we are doing is that we are integrating with the hosting provider, looking at downloads and in real time, and then as well as we have a pixel that sits on the brand side. very similar to sort of like the Facebook pixels or the Twitter pixels of the world that do attribution to those platforms. We are just sort of agnostic to podcasting particularly.
And so how does that work? So I'll be the first to admit it here. I mean, as I
Sure.
mentioned, I do love Switcher. I think it's really stepped up my live stream game, quite frankly. We do have a partnership where I can use their software. Otherwise, I wouldn't mention them on the top of the show, obviously.
Yeah.
But how, like, I always wonder, like, do people remember the codes, right? Like, do they remember how do you spell trap? One E, no E, one P, two Ps? Who knows,
Right.
right? And
Like you're basically measuring human memory, right? That's what you're doing right now. You're measuring human memory, which is specifically with discount codes and especially vanity URLs, right? Where go to ZipRecruiter.com/NPR. No one does that. They type ZipRecruiter into the Google search bar and goes right. So brands know that, and they put multipliers on top of things, and they're like, well, how did I hear about that awesome article couch, right? I have no idea. I don't remember how I got there, but I got there, which is sort of important. Our goal is, again, it's panel-based methodologies here. It's households. But our goal is to help brands make better decisions about that, right? So that they're not sort of relying on people's memories, that we are sort of looking at behavior and using analysis on behavior and not memory.
So let's dive into that, though. How do you do that? When you talked about the pixel, I mean, so I'm thinking about what I do when I listen to podcasts. I mean, I got podcasts running all day long.
Sure.
When I'm not in a meeting, I'm listening to a podcast. When I'm writing, it's in the background. Sometimes, depending on who's talking, I got to turn it off because, I mean, they're all over
good
the
for you
place,
on concentration.
right? But I do have it running probably half of the day, quite frankly. So how do you? So explain that to me. Like, how does the pixel work? How do I even get to that to be measured? How does it work?
Sure. So, I mean, you are currently attached to your home Wi-Fi, right? When you download a podcast, you are attached to your home Wi-Fi. You then decide to go visit the brand site, you are attached to your home Wi-Fi. We don't have a user identifier in podcasting, right? So I don't know how many people are in your household. I don't know who actually downloaded the podcast. But what we can say is that statistically, it's highly likely that if you downloaded the episode with an ad in it, and then you went to the brand site, that ad probably had something to do with it, right? And then multiply that by 1,000 or 2,000, right? There's a whole bunch of people exactly like you. Now, podcasting data is limited because of cell towers. They throw 60 million people through a single IP address, so we basically can't use corporate or mobile networks to do attribution. But what we can say is that if we can talk to 10 people, of 10 people, we can talk to 5 of them. One of them had an apple for breakfast. We can basically assume that the other person one of the other people had an apple for breakfast too, right? And that's sort of what panel-based methodology is for podcasting, is that we are looking at household level data and saying, download, visit to the brand site based off of sort of network or IP address, and then using that to just sort of Bray traffic did as well.
Very, very interesting. So let me just, I'm a journalist. I always have to play everything back, right, to make sure I understand it.
Sure.
So basically the way that works, if I'm listening to the Washington football team, NBC Washington podcast, and they say, whatever, buy the latest hat, which for the record, we did have a show with Nick Westergaard, how hard it is to rebrand, quickly, which is what Washington is currently doing. So if you guys want to listen to that. But if they say, and so my point is the hats are currently super ugly, so I wouldn't buy one, even if you give it to me for free. But let's assume they're going to have a good looking hat at some point. And I would buy it, right? And they say it on the Washington podcast, hey, get the hat. So my internet certainly knows that I listened to it, downloaded it, whatever. It came on my device, and then I click. Then I go to NFL Shop, which is where the pixel comes from. So then what you're saying is that's how you keep track of how the conversion happened. Is that right? Did I understand that correctly?
Exactly. So it's that simple. It's not like there's no user identifier here. Like we don't know what's going on that side of things, but we can basically assume that ad about the Washington football team, who I'm sure their hats are going to be amazing at some point, is going to drive you to that site, right? podcasting is obviously an incredibly personal and incredibly effective medium for brands and advertisers. Right? It's their favorite person telling you about their favorite product, and I think that is really powerful when it comes to the medium. The problem is that the technology for measuring it is more offline, and it's not offline, right? Like we use radio or billboard methodologies for something that is inherently digital. That leads to a calamity of errors, right? So from our standpoint, right, like we want to help grow podcast advertising. And to do that, we need more advertisers to enter the space, right? So our goal here is to really just help with the measurement side of things and let those publishers really, their content and their ads really shine.
It's super interesting, and I think I do buy the whole theory that you can kind of take your guess that whoever clicked over, that they probably listened to the podcast most likely. Nobody else in this household likes the Washington football team, quite frankly. How about
They will eventually.
well, who knows? They don't really follow my lead too often, but fingers crossed. But how about so we have a lot of marketers listening too, right? So there's really two sides of tracking things. One is you run advertising campaigns, and what's funny about advertising campaigns, I've been a content marketer the last decade, and 5 years ago we would have screamed at you and said, we're content marketers, we're focusing on good stories, we don't do advertising. And of course, that era has long gone, right? I do all advertising every day now, right, for all kinds of different campaigns. So advertising matters. It is a way, of course, everybody wants to make money. It is a way to accelerate your projects. On the flip side, we have the in-house campaigns, right? So let me give you an example. So for example, I'm doing a podcast and I want to push you to buy my services, right? Whatever that might be, or like I want you to buy my book, or I want you to buy my marketing services, or hire my company to build your website, or whatever, right? You see where I'm going with this, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course.
Does that work as well? Do you have clients like that, or is it mostly like let's call it the entertainment model, where you have a podcaster and then you have an external advertiser?
We work with sort of the marketing side of this business too. Generally, yeah, you can launch a podcast, right? You don't have a built-in audience generally, right? A lot of what happens is then we're doing the podcast marketing, which is basically still buying ads, but you're buying ads for a podcast, right? It just so happens to be put out by everybody's got one now. Mailchimp, Squarespace, they all have their sort of branded podcast, which is very similar to content marketing. It's telling stories around small business in some cases. Mostly a lot of small business is one, right? But in order to get people to actually listen to those podcasts, generally you're buying ads on, and that's a really effective way of getting downloads and getting new subscribers to your podcast. Because to your point, it's an incredibly sticky medium, and it builds trust with an audience in order to get them to know that you know what you're doing, and then be the problems that they're trying to solve, right? So yeah, we've seen that before, where brand launches a podcast, but sort of doesn't have that built-in audiences, and then we'll use other podcasts, buying basically podcast ads for their podcast to grow their podcast.
Got it. So what kind of, we had Heather Osgood on the show, and of course,
Really?
Yeah, of course. And do you know her? How do you know her?
Yeah. She was one of our first clients here at Podsites.
Okay, awesome. So basically, she talked about you have to have an audience, right? Like 5,000,
Yeah.
whatever the number was that she threw around per episode, and which is kind of interesting too, because I know everybody wants. You can tell me your opinion, but I think she mentioned the first 30 days is one of the important time periods, and I get it, but I've seen some of my really, really old podcasts take off after like way past the 30 days. I don't know why. I don't know if they're showing up as recommended on Apple Podcasts. Do you know what I mean? but they're
Yeah,
still
you're getting
performing.
in the weeds here. In the first 30 days is generally the accepted metric for impression counting for embedded ads, right? So the it's not a dynamic being inserted, which means like what you're talking is sort of run a network or run a show, where I'm buying into ads, dynamically placing ads into back catalogs or run a show type things, right? So the first ad is generally the impressions within the first 30 days are actually counted towards the buy. This is why brands love embedded ads, specifically on some of these smaller podcasts. Is right. I only pay for the 30 days worth of impressions, but then I'm getting the long tail as I continue to as the podcast continues to age. Right. So there's agencies out there that will exclusively buying embedded ads for this very reason, is that they basically get the added value that if a podcaster starts to blow up, they are seeing basically increased impressions for the fact that that the ad will never be replaced.
And you guys know I have strong opinions when it comes to these things. Even when we had the affiliate marketing show with Ryan, and now his name slipped my mind, over in Europe. But I talked about affiliate marketing. Of course, we don't want just affiliate marketers to take all the danger in a campaign. I mean, you have to transfer some of that to the brand who you're doing work for. Same here, right? So if some company, if you feel like they're trying to take you for a spin because of that 30-day number, and sell it, right? Negotiate it. So what is
To
the
Heather's point, most of the downloads will appear within the first 30 days. So
right,
she's getting you for 10% at tops, right? Mostly
right?
it's a much smaller number than that. And there also, right, just predicting how many downloads you're going to get on like any given episode is not great, right? So yeah, you have a built-in audience that does 20,000 downloads a month on average, or episode on average. But those can swing wildly based off of what you just showed earlier, right?
Hmm.
So some of your episodes are going to do great, and some of them aren't going to do great. Brand's not going to beat you up on some of these things because of the fact that one episode was a miss, because there's other episodes that are going to be better.
Absolutely, and it is kind of hit and miss and up and down. It's an interesting thing. So talk about the Pixel though. So you have all these different podcast apps, right? You got Google and Spotify and Apple and whatever, Breaker and Stitcher and
Sure.
yeah, I mean I can go on and we can just fill
Podcast
for
Addict,
you.
and then there's literally hundreds of them. Never mind your web browser as you listen to some of these things.
Right, smart speakers. Tell Siri to
Yeah,
play my smart podcast, guys.
those crush, by the way.
What?
Ads on smart speakers are like crush. They always perform really well.
Okay, cool. So does it work across all those devices though? You can measure it. I mean, it doesn't make any difference whether it's Apple or Spotify or Alexa.
Yeah. At the end of the day, what's happening is that when you download a podcast from Apple, you're not actually downloading it from Apple, right? You're downloading it from the hosting provider. Apple's just linking over to the MP3 file. And so the hosting provider always, in the same way Anchor is getting your stats right now, the hosting provider is always going to see, that a download happened, right? Podsite sits in the middle sometimes, so there's something called an RSS prefix where it's basically a Bitly link where you hit us and then you go download the podcast, or it's a dynamic insertion which happens sort of, and the tracking happens behind the scenes. But sort of the system for record of downloads is always going to be at the hosting provider. It's never going to be at the app player because, again, there's hundreds of them out there. Never mind just scrolling through the web and finding a podcast and listening to it there.
And people do that. I find that always interesting to find out. So how big when you find? So do you first of all do you find the advertising podcast or do you just work on the tracking? How do people work with you?
We're on the end of the campaign, right, or the end of the sales cycle, where I come in and I submit an RFP and I want to buy some ads and I talk to a bunch of networks but I want to know, did it work, right? Traditionally, that was left up to the brand, where I could buy $1 million worth of podcast ads and the publisher would say I got X number of impressions. but who knows how well it did. Our job is to help answer how well it did. Not every podcast campaign is going to sort of knock it out of the park, but what we have continued to find is what marketers really want is just the ability to optimize, right? They want the ability to try something, see what worked, what didn't, and then double down on what did work, and then rotate in new shows that, for testing and experimenting. So it's really about how do you validate the media? Like, is podcast even going to work for me? And then about scaling it afterwards. I go with my dog in. Give me 1 second. She'll just whine at the door forever.
Say that again.
I had to let my dog in. She'll just whine at the door forever.
That's how it goes anymore today. I don't think anybody cares anymore when we get up during the live stream.
Yeah, so my kids might make an appearance here in a second.
No, nobody cares anymore. So talk to me about how big does a show need to be for advertisers to even consider tracking things? Like how many listeners? And I mean, we had Tamara Burkett on the show, and she talked about, you have to remember, out of 100 people that are your true audience, 3 are ready to buy. And then you have to catch them at the right time, right? And if you get to 6, even better. But if you get to 10, probably won't ever happen. So just something, so it's good to remember that. What are like the similar numbers when it comes to podcast advertising? Like if I have 100 listeners, for example, that are the right audience, how many are likely to take a step, or to do whatever? Like, what do you have any kind of numbers available on that?
We've done a bunch of benchmarks here that talks about sort of 1% of the 1 to 2% of the audience. For obviously for direct to consumer brands, that is higher. You can see some 2 to 3 to 4% sometimes if there's really good alignment between the content and the brand. And then for traditional finance banks, things like that, it's obviously lower, higher LTV, but lower conversion rate. There's not a magic number for number of downloads. To your point, some of these niche shows can charge sort of up to $100, $150 CPMs, specifically like, podcasts for lawyers, right? Those are always going to do, or podcasts for venture capitalists, those are always going to do well. So from a scale perspective, like if it's general entertainment, you're talking about a $30 CPM on sort of the high side of things at this point for just general entertainment podcast. So in order for a brand to go through the rigmarole of sponsoring you, you need to have a decent number of impressions just to make the actual buy worthwhile. But we have seen some really small shows that do really well from an advertising standpoint, but those are really direct engagements, and they are, year-long sponsorships. That kind of thing.
And when you say impressions, that's basically when somebody is listening to the show, right? Is that the roughly simplified here, the same thing?
Yeah, so because we do dynamic insertion traction, they won't fire a tracking URL unless the impression made it to the device, so it's not every download is actually counted in those things. So we use a generic term called impression, but we're talking about downloads. So Heather will tell you it's between 5 and 10,000, which is about right, specifically for those types of podcasters, and then their CPMs can go up and down depending on sort of how well their short show converts. To your point, if I have 100 listeners and 3 of them are ready to purchase, that's a pretty good conversion rate, right? If I've got 10 of them that are ready to purchase, then like I'm buying that show all day long for the rest of the life. Those obviously that matters, and how engaged the audience is. All those things are sort of important indicators, but you don't know unless you measure, which is sort of where we come in on the backside of things. Is that it's sort of really important if you're going to scale into and validate the medium, like you need to do these things early on, so you're not just buying one podcast ad that didn't work and then all of a sudden you're like, never trying podcasting again. That's what we see a lot of, is that brands were like, oh, this is a cool medium, like I want to try it, and then they do one small buy, and then they then set up the KPI tracking correctly, and then they churn, which is terrible. So That being said, there's obviously sort of best practices here, right? Like you can't go into podcast advertising with $1,000. You have to have a significant amount of budget to do a decent buy to see if it's working or it's not, which is obviously somewhat of a cliff for small SMB type of advertisers. But still direct consumer brands do fairly well here, so it's generally not an issue. We encourage people to buy their first ones or, our first runs. They're not run a show or they're not run a network. And that's because you generally see better conversion rates, see better ideas of what's going to happen with sort of a first run versus sort of the run a network, et cetera. And then, buy a few shows. The first one might not work. The 1 out of 3 will work. And then you can make better decisions about where you're going to spend your next money.
Interesting. And so when you say a decent budget, give me a rough number here. What's a good budget to start with?
In the tens of thousands. We're talking between, we try to say around 20,000 would be a good thing because you're buying enough impressions that you can buy more first runs than just one show, right? That's what people sort of get into trouble here is when they spend all their money on a single show and they're like, oh, that didn't work. Like, no shit. Every once in a while, you're going to see, that show just might not work for your audience, and that's fine, right? The idea here is to spread it out over a few, and then see what happens.
And so then, when people work with you, what are you working on the advertising, the ad part as well, or just the tracking? I'm not sure I followed that exactly.
There's a ton of people in the space, right? So you have sort of the hosting providers, which actually serve the content. Some of those hosting providers are also ad servers as well, which is for dynamic insertion. But any hosting provider, you can sell your own embedded ad for it at any given time for any given reason, right? And then you integrate some tracking on the back end of it, right? There's then the hosting providers, which are due to dynamic insertion. There's some ad networks out there, like some of the hosting providers who actually have their own sales team, so they'll sell into your back catalog. It's a sort of a very interesting market in that fact that it's not as well established as like digital, where I can go to Google, et cetera, and buy off of 10,000 different sites, right? If you want to buy 10,000 podcasts on, you're going to talk to 990 different publishers, right? That's sort of where the problem is with advertising and scaling it up, is the fact that it's a little fragmented. That being said, it gives you a lot of diverse options to actually do your buy, right? So you can buy some of the small shows, and then you can go all the way up to the big boys and the Art and NPR and spend money there. It's just about sort of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't.
So when you talk about the impressions earlier, so when I have an ad at the beginning of the show, as soon as it starts playing, that's an impression, right? If it plays at the 2-minute mark, that's an impression if somebody gets to the 2-minute mark, right? Is that basically how I understood that?
Right.
Or?
So what you just did was a pre-roll, right? They ran before the content even happened. There's generally those are not as valuable. They want higher CPM rates as a mid-roll, which is sort of dead in the center or in the middle of the content. The theory being that less people will skip it because they're already sort of in the flow of the content. That being said, pre-rolls do really well. Post-rolls obviously don't do all that well because it's at the end of the content, and very few people stick around after the credits. The dynamic ad servers will make sure that if it's a streaming get, that they make sure that the ad was actually downloaded, or at least enough of the episode was downloaded to fire off an impression. Versus just blindly saying it after 2 seconds that it reached all the way to the mid-roll,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and honestly, what I do when I get a pre-roll ad, and I know that's what it is, I just go 15 seconds, skip a couple times automatically. And when it's the pre-roll, I think I said that wrong. But when it's a mid-roll, sometimes I don't make the effort, right? I just let it run because I'm already listening to the show. Is that common?
No, I mean, people make a lot of, I have some my cousin that likes to talk about this. I skip all the ads, right? But he
Yeah.
owns like a Simply Safe security system. He's heard of like all these different brands that appeared in the podcast advertising, because whether he can has this highbrow approach that he starts always skips the ads. Like no one always skips the ads, right? It's just not a thing. It's some people things people do. Yes, that is a behavior. People skip ads in podcasting, and that's why when people start stacking ads, specifically like we see one mid roll and then two mid rolls, and then all of a sudden people are stacking four mid rolls in the middle of a back to back in the middle of a podcast episode. Yeah, like the tail end of those ads are going to get skipped all day long because of the fact that I've just listened to 3 minutes of advertising straight. I'm not going to do it anymore. Generally, as long as they are sort of split out into the nice sort of chunks there, it's not a behavior that is overly transparent in a lot of these things. And
Got
again,
it.
downstream.
Downstream. Yep. Got it. Makes sense. So let's say, I don't know if we got to this as much earlier, but so let's say I want to run a campaign for my own company, right? Let's assume it's a good podcast. It's something worth listening to. It's not just a marketing gobbledygook, crappy podcast, right, where I'm telling everybody how awesome I am, but people are listening to it. And I want to measure conversions to my own brand website. Brands can sign up for your service doing that as well, I assume?
Yeah, I mean that's all we do is work with brands to measure the effectiveness of that podcast advertising. It can take multiple different shapes and forms, but at the end of the day, if there's a listener and then there's an on-site action, we can measure that.
Got it. And how much does it cost? Or what's like the range, I guess?
We there's two pricing models. One is sort of pay as you go, right, which is the basically a $2 CPM. It's good for sort of I want to run a one-off campaign and just see like how it works. And then we have a lot of flat rate pricing. So if I'm really thinking about investing in the medium and I want sort of a better pricing than the $2 CPM, we do, flat rate, which, helps with we also help with a lot of the research and the reporting as well. We do all the ad pulls out of the podcast or, make sure that the ad actually appeared in the podcast, which is a big deal, for some of these smaller shows, those kind of things. So the goal here is really sort of always on marketing tool for podcast advertisers.
Got it. Sean, very interesting topic. I definitely learned something new.
Good. That's all that matters.
Always appreciate. I always appreciate when that happens.
Yeah, of course.
And of course, people can find you guys at podsights.com, podsights.com.
You can misspell it too, and you'll end up there too.
I'm sorry, say that again.
If you misspell it, there's a redirect too. So again, you're always gonna. This is our whole thing, right? Like we do a lot of podcast advertising, right? And you can actually see the spikes in our Google traffic to the PODSITES from Google, because they just spell it differently, and that's fine, right? But we know that they're coming from a podcast because of podcast attribution.
Because that's how people spell it. Very interesting. Well, thank you for joining us, and thanks for sharing your insights. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks everyone for listening, and please, if you like the show, feel free to subscribe and leave a review if you like. If you listened on LinkedIn, we also live stream this on LinkedIn, ctrap.online/LinkedIn. Try to do one a week. I'll be quite honest, doing the video is a lot more strenuous than just talking with each other instead of having to look at the camera and looking like not just paying attention, but actually looking like you're paying attention. So, and especially for the guests, we don't take them off the camera ever. Appreciate you guys listening. Almost at 200 episodes, one more episode to go. And there's a fun surprise, episode 200. And there's another one, I shouldn't even mention it, but we got a big marketing star coming up here, probably in early November. Just booked him. Can't tell you who it is, but I don't usually get the fanboy thing out here, but definitely a fanboy moment for me. I'm Christoph Trapp. Thanks for listening. Until next time.